recently hosted two guests on the podcast. The first being the father, Steve, who was an entrepreneur and successfully exited his company. Matt and I asked him about how he and his wife taught their children about money, work, generosity, and avoided many of the pitfalls that often come with wealth. We received a whole bunch of practical lessons that listeners will truly benefit from. But, Matt, we didn't stop there. We talked also with Steve's son, who is also named Steven, and heard from his perspective what his parents did well, what shaped his character, and the lessons he's now applying to himself as a father. With those two conversations as the backdrop, Matt and I wanted to reflect on what they said and share the big ideas from those conversations. We thought it was pretty special to have the viewpoints from Generation 1 and then also from Generation 2. So today we just want to speak less on what they said, because we want you guys to go and check out those episodes, which is the two episodes right before this one. And we would rather discuss the big ideas that they talk about. So kind of pull the main themes, and Matt and I would just want to have a conversation about that.
Yeah, they were both so gracious and so humble, and just really enjoyed talking to Steve and Steven. And as is true in most things in life, Steven, I think you'd agree with this. There was no silver bullet or big revelation or magic formula, but just lots of little things done really well over a long period of time. And obviously the results have been spectacular for this family.
So there were four themes that Matt and I pulled from these two conversations. So we want to touch on each of these four themes. So the first one is generosity. We thought it was just really incredible the way that they made generosity practical in their kids' lives. And they gave a bunch of different examples that they did. They did mission trips, so getting their kids out of their comfort zone into different parts of the world. Christmas gifts was another important thing that they modeled generosity. They basically set a budget and said, hey, you kids have to choose a charity or something to give to. There was just so many different practical lessons, and generosity was just a theme of their lives.
Yeah, again, I think back to my first point, no big reveal, no one conversation on the topic, or no specific experience. There were many different experiences over many years that added up for Steven, Generation 2, to adopting many of the same practices now in his adulthood, which he's hoping to pass on to his kids, which they hopefully pass on. So a great tradition of generosity that Generation 1 firmly established, with lots of little things, conversations at the dinner table, like you said, Christmas giving, annual involvement in different organizations. And now Steven, as we talked about on the episode with him, Generation 2 is running an organization that helps people his age, so similar peers, practice generosity through Ambassadors Club. So really loved hearing about that, and just really shows how powerful this theme can be and how much impact it can have on a family's grasp of wealth.
The reason that we wanted to put this as our first bullet point, because I don't know, if there is a magic bullet, Matt, for families and wealth, I think it probably falls in this category, if I'm being honest, of the honesty of having gratitude and generosity. I don't know if we have run across a family of significant means where generosity isn't something that they're thinking about or something that they are practicing. You can look even outside of the clients that we work with, just in society. There's the giving pledge, I think, that a lot of the big billionaires have signed, and Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, that sort of thing. So it comes a point where, especially when you've reached a certain level of wealth, when I think that I don't know if it's just the accumulation of things that you've learned over life, but your focus turns from kind of being inward to then being outward, and saying, hey, how can this wealth and this money, or this orientation that I have, this needs to change in order for me to really be fulfilled. And that's what I think Matt and I truly believe, is that fulfillment doesn't come from inside you. It definitely comes from having an other orientation, or something beyond yourself is what you have to find your fulfillment in, versus just what's in front of you.
Yeah, there was a great case study, Stephen, in a book written by another advisor named Michael Cole, who works with ultra high net worth families. And he basically did a compare and contrast of the Rockefellers, who are now on, I think, generation 6 or 7 of wealth, doing very well with government involvement, public service, and a big foundation that does lots of good work. And you compared them as kind of a good example to shoot for, with generosity being a core principle for their family as well, versus the Vanderbilts, who famously spent a lot of the money, and a few generations after G1 basically didn't have much money left. And again, just using his example of, both ends of the spectrum, generosity was definitely a core factor in why the Rockefellers have been successful in passing on wealth and all the different forms of capital that we'll talk about later.
So the second key point that we pulled from was really trying to answer the question of when do you pay for stuff for kids / give them money, or when do you help them? And we thought that Steve had a couple of great principles that he shared, and then Stephen also hit on a few points as well. So from Steve's perspective, he basically just kind of laid the groundwork of saying, hey, we'd love to help with a down payment on a home, and that's probably as much as you should expect from us. So they were pretty clear as to what the expectation would be moving forward. Whether that's the direction that people choose to go, we're not saying that that's the right one or the wrong one, but it's the fact that he gave his family clarity, I think, is the key point and takeaway from there. And we have a couple thoughts on a down payment on a house and why that's probably one of the best ones that you can choose. But what were some other, I guess Stephen also had some things that he thought were really key that his parents instilled in them.
Yeah, Stephen hit on the idea of paying for principles, where his parents spent money on things that mattered a lot to them and communicated what was important to the kids, like Stephen and his sisters. And the example he gave was paying for hotel rooms for Stephen and his girlfriend when they would go to places together so that they didn't have to share a room, because that was something the parents felt strongly about. And then also, this one just blew me away. Stephen sharing that his mom had communicated to the kids she was willing at any time to pay for counseling for the kids, for herself, for them to do it together. It took a lot of humility for Stephen's mom to say she was willing to pay for counseling to help undo any emotional damage or address any emotional baggage from Stephen's childhood. And I loved that as a way for parents to spend money, even though the cost of counseling itself is not that significant, but just the principle that was communicated there of wanting to be in good relationship with their kids was something I loved seeing Steve and his wife do really well.
So what are the principles that your family values, and are you willing to back those principles up with your resources? And we think that's probably a really good use of your money. So let's jump back to down payment on a house, or help with a down payment. And we think that this probably has one of the highest ROIs, or at least highest emotional ROIs. We can talk about the financial decisions of that, but owning a home is probably one of the most important decisions that you can make. At least here in America, here in the West, people want to own a house, and it's not easy to own a house, especially as this next generation comes up. Houses are very expensive. So one of the things that you can assist with probably has the biggest bang for your buck is helping your kids get into a place.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways parents can support their kids, whether it's funding a business that they're starting or letting them move in to the parents' house for some period of time under some formal or informal rental agreement, buying them nice things of various kinds. So there's all kinds of ways parents can support their kids, but buying a house, which is something we've been helping more and more clients do in recent months, is one of the best ways to do that. Like you said, Stephen, just because there's very high emotional return and emotional benefit from the kid's perspective, and there's less risk from the parent's perspective, assuming it's done properly and the kids can afford the monthly payments on the back end. This is a great way for parents to make a one-time gift that has a really big impact.
So I think you said an important key there, Matt, is you're not gifting your kids just a house that's beyond their means, but you're assisting them with the down payment, because that's a pretty significant amount now, especially depending on where you live, if you live in a city or that sort of thing. But an important key is that, can your son or daughter or their spouses together, can they afford the home, the monthly payment on their own incomes versus needing to get subsidy from the parents? If that needs to happen in order for them to afford the home, then they're living beyond their means, and that wouldn't be a good thing. But yeah, finances isn't so much just, running the numbers. A lot of it has to do with the emotions that come with money. And I don't know, we think that this one has a really good return on your investment. So We thought that was a good takeaway there. Number 3 is communication. And this is just general communication about money and how their family, the atmosphere of their family, where it wasn't just a strict kind of sit down talk, but there was many, many multiple conversations. And the way that I think about this is that it wasn't like, hey, kids, we're going to talk about money today, but it was just in their natural, as they went about their day, it just comes up and they were willing to step into that. So I think that's an important principle for parents to take away too, is that you don't have to have, a bullet listed outline of exactly what you want to talk about. I mean, that's great if that's how you roll, but the main thing here is just having the conversation quite a bit. And that conversation doesn't have to be just words. It can also be actions. So one of the things that Steve did was, he developed part of his property into a pumpkin patch and made his kids work in it and their friends and that sort of thing. So that taught them, I think Steven said like, oh, I want to go buy this T-shirt. Like that's definitely not worth, hours in the pumpkin patch for me to buy that shirt. So he was equating hours of work with what that thing costs. So that was really great.
Yeah, I think starting young with money related conversations was a big takeaway for me and something I plan to implement with my family when my kids are old enough. But things like giving them an allowance and having them allocated between spending, saving, and giving. Steve's agreement with Steven to pay him in stocks for any books that Steven was reading over the summer. And even to the first thing I said about little things over time, chore charts and giving the kids the firsthand experience in the pumpkin patch, like you said, Steven, just lots of little things over many years that gave Steven and his sisters a really good grasp on money, how to handle it, what to do, what not to do. And I just love that a lot.
One of the things that is really beneficial of having these money conversations or these money scenarios play out in your family is that there's a good chance that they will probably mess things up, but the likelihood of that being catastrophic is very small. So, talking about allowance money, maybe that's $10 or $20. They might, blow it on some candy or whatever, and then can't buy something else later down the line. That's a failure in their eyes, and they'll learn from that. But it's not, gonna mess them up for the rest of their lives. They can't, they're not in mountains and mountains of debt or something like that. So, is there ways where you can teach the principle and basically have them fail small? Is kind of the idea there.
Yeah, Steven, another point you made too was the clarity of communication from Steve to Steven around what support would look like for the kids in their adulthood. And again, no right or wrong answer. There's no formula that works for every family, but this decision that Steve and his wife made to help kids with the down payment and basically limit the extent of the giving to that and communicating that the kids shouldn't expect much more beyond that down the road, I think is something we can all learn from around removing ambiguity and reducing the odds of any mismatched expectations or confusion or disappointment down the road because of the clarity that Steve gave to his kids on that front.
And that's another important piece too, is that, you talked about teaching your kids about money when they're young and that sort of thing. You kind of go, okay, yeah, I can understand that. But I think another big bridge is that you need to continue that conversation into adulthood. It doesn't end. So just because the kids are grown up doesn't mean that, you can wipe your hands and say, like, hey, we taught you about money. That's it. It needs to be a continual conversation about it. It's not something that you should bring up every single family dinner or something like that, but that's not what we're saying. But having those talks and those chats, if they're just offhand while you're doing dishes or stuff like that, I think as your kids grow and mature and have families of their own is even more important maybe than when they were younger. All right, number 4 is wealth doesn't give you ultimate fulfillment. Steve talked about this quite a bit and his journey from being an entrepreneur, building a business, selling it, and then finding himself doing laundry and dishes and questioning, okay, what am I good for now? Is this all that my life is doing laundry, dishes, and taking care of the dog? I think that says a lot about the lie that wealth and material possessions will give you ultimate fulfillment. And Steve's come out the other side on that and obviously has found purpose and meaning and that sort of thing. But it's something to, I think, really remind ourselves, because it's very easy just to get caught in the rat race or the hamster wheel of trying to accumulate.
Yeah, Steve's honesty around dealing with insomnia and insecurity and anxiety as he transitioned from working to selling the business to being fun employed, as I like to call it, was really helpful for me to hear, as we will face those situations ourselves to varying degrees, but also, Stephen, for you and I to help clients transitioning into retirement, whether it's after a business sale or just after the end of their corporate job or teaching job, whatever it is, just helping them know that they need to find something to fill their time, because life is about much more than money. And part of our role, I know you feel the same way, Stephen, is to help them find fulfillment in life, because money alone is not going to give it to them. And hearing from Steve about that specifically was super helpful for me.
Mm-hmm. And the emphasis, if it's not money, like what else can it be? And at least family was a big part of Steve's journey and emphasis. And we saw this play out by, he was home for dinner from work and they took vacations together as a family. So his presence was felt. And then Stephen even reiterated, said like, man, how did my dad do that? He was building a business and he was home at 5 p.m. That's something that's really hard for me to do he's a young entrepreneur himself, but his dad made that commitment to be home and be present with his family. The last thing on this topic is, sometimes when you've accumulated a sum of money, you can have feelings of guilt, because you feel like, hey, maybe I was lucky, or I worked really hard and now I'm at this place that's much better than other people in society. And I think there was just a theme there of moving from guilt to gratitude, of saying, hey, instead of thinking that we deserve this, it's more of saying, hey, we're really fortunate. And then that obviously bends to generosity and that sort of thing. So having that posture of gratitude, I think, does a big number on alleviating that guilt that people can feel by accumulating what they have.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on this topic was just how this discussion with Steve brought to mind a Bible verse for me from the book of Ecclesiastes, which is one of my favorite, but it's just very blunt and direct. And the verse says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income." And again, Steve's honesty really demonstrated the truth and the wisdom of that verse. And I think that's really important to remember anytime we find ourselves being sucked into believing that just having a certain amount of money at some point in the future will, bring us unending joy and fulfillment, and just knowing that that's not true.
That's great. Okay, so those were the four themes, key points that we pulled from this conversation with Steve and Stephen. And the last thing that I'll say, just as we conclude here, is that Steve and his wife, Lori, knowingly or unknowingly, basically transferred all of the forms of capital that can be passed on. And this is something that's researched pretty extensively by family wealth advisors, Jay Hughes, James Grubman, those types of folks. And there's really 5 areas of capital that can be transferred to the next generation. And those are human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, spiritual capital, and then the last one being financial capital. So much emphasis is just on the financial capital, and those other 4 areas sometimes get mixed. So we'll include a link to kind of the description of all those different types of capitals that kind of round out a whole person's being. So it's not just about the money, it's also about all those other areas as well. And we think that Steve did a really good job. Steve and his wife did a really good job of doing this, of sharing this and promoting these different areas to their kids. So we'll share that, and then we'll probably talk about these areas on maybe another episode, Matt. But I think that wraps up what we got today. Matt, any last thoughts?
No, just like you said, Stephen, the Rife family is a great example for us to learn from and to model a lot of what they show to be best practices. So I'm really grateful they spent time with us, and hopefully this is helpful to our listeners. I know it's definitely been helpful for me personally, so I'm really grateful for it.
Well, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Kevin, our wonderful editor, and we'll see you guys next time.
Like our perspective about wealth? You can explore our approach at birchwoodcapital.com. We work closely with high net worth families to manage their wealth and create thoughtful, customized plans and strategies. The information in this podcast is for general, informational, and educational purposes only. It should not be relied upon for any investment, financial, or any other professional advice. The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organizations. Investing in financial markets involves risk, including the loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Consult with a qualified professional before making financial decisions. Thanks for listening.